In this video, we're going to go over how to properly export your After Effects 3D camera into Blender. There's one setting that everybody messes up, and I'm going to tell you what it is. Okay, so here we are inside of After Effects, and then we'll drag our footage into a new comp. And this is 9:16 footage shot on my iPhone. The process is the same for 16:9 footage. The first thing we're going to do is do a 3D camera track on our footage. So I'll just right click on our footage, go to track and track camera, and we'll let this do its thing. And while this is going, I just want to mention one thing. This is not the only way to do this. This is just my preferred method for this type of shot. You can use whatever you want. Okay, so this is done tracking. There's a couple things that we can do here. We can move our mouse over and analyze the disk that appears there, and whatever looks good, like it's locked onto the surface and not slanted. So maybe right here, if you just click there, you can see it selected 3 tracking points. So that's one option. The other option is we can click and drag and lasso select a bunch of these trackers here, and it'll use the average of all of those. I think I'm just going to select the 3 because I think that looks good. That looks like it's locked onto the surface, and I'll right click. Now, the one thing that I think a lot of people are forgetting to do that's preventing the ground plane from actually being aligned with the world grid inside of Blender is that they don't select set ground plane and origin. So if you don't do this, the camera and the ground plane will come in all messed up, not aligned to the world grid inside of Blender. So when you right click, just select that, then right click again and do create solid and camera. And if you want, you can create some null objects here. So create 3 null objects. It's not necessary to create them. And the reason why we're creating a solid is that that's going to be our ground plane inside of Blender. Now, if for some reason you forget to set ground plane in origin, or you just, for some reason, you can't do it, then I'll show you a manual option inside of Blender at the end of the video. So now we'll just go down to our camera here. I'll press U on the keyboard, or you can just twirl down the transform here and select the position and orientation and hit Control C to copy them, or just go to Edit, Copy. And we'll switch over to Blender. Here we are inside of Blender. I'm just going to open up this side menu here to show the AE to Blend menu. The only thing we need to do from here is click on Create Camera. And what that's going to do is paste in our camera, and of course it's all the way over here. So that's actually a pretty big scene because the camera's all the way out here. So one of the things I can do is just undo this, and instead of dealing with a very large scene, what we can do is actually set the scale here. So I'm going to set the scale to 1000 instead of 100, and then I'm going to create camera. So now you can see here that the camera is set right there. And you can see the camera's animated and everything. I'm actually going to select the camera and I'll just scale it up so that we can see it better. One thing we need to fix is the keyframe offset. So if I select this parent, this is what the camera is parented to. You can see it here. The camera is parented to an empty object. If we zoom in here, we can see that the keyframes start on frame 0. That's because After Effects starts on frame 0, but Blender starts on frame 1. So what we need to do is just shift this over 1 frame. Okay, so that's all set. Before I go further, I actually want to adjust my camera settings. So we want to match our footage. So I'm just going to do 1080 by 1920, which is what our footage is. And then another thing to note is go to your frame rate and switch it to 24. Typically, it would be 2398 if you're shooting on most professional film cameras, but I shot on my iPhone and it does 24 natively. So we'll just make sure to use 24 so that the track is accurate. I'm going to switch back to After Effects and I'm going to click on the plane. We're going to twirl down the properties and just go into transform and select the first 4. So anchor point, position, scale, and orientation. Those are the 4 that you want. We can copy that or just go to edit, copy, switch back over to Blender and hit create plane. Now watch the world grid and the origin of the world grid. So when I hit create plane, it creates a plane at the center there. It's hard to see, so I'm just going to scale it up. So there we go. And I'm going to select the empty. So the ground plane and the camera are now aligned. We have this extra camera over here that Blender created by default. So I'm just going to delete that because we don't need it. So if I go into our camera, you can see that this is what the camera track looks like. Now it's kind of hard to judge if this is accurate, so what we need to do is actually select the camera, go into the camera settings here, and one last setting that we need to fix in order to make sure that our track is accurate is the focal length. Right now it's set at 50 as the default, and this is going to cause some problems with our track. Our track is going to be off. So let's load up the footage and take a look at that before we switch this. So I'll click on background images, add image, movie clip, open, and load that in. And I'm just going to change this so that the opacity is up all the way so that we don't see through it. And I'm going to add an HDRI so that we can actually see this, because if I just switch over to the rendered view, you can see here that it's working off of this default light. So that's looking pretty good. Now, the only thing is that we can't see through the HDRI, so we have to go into our scene settings. I have it mapped to my quick favorites, so I just press Q and then I have transparent here. But if you don't have that, if you didn't set that up, then you can just go into your scene settings, scroll down to film over here, and then click on transparent. And that will enable that. And then what we can do is select the ground plane, go into the properties here and go to visibility and select shadow catcher. So that'll just make it a shadow catcher. It'll be see-through. And the only thing that'll appear there is the shadow. We've done a bunch of stuff, but I just want to remind you that we didn't change the focal length here. It's still at 50 millimeters. So this track is most likely going to be off. So you can see toward the end here, you can really see it shifting. If I zoom in here, you can really see like the person's floating there. And that's because our focal length is wrong. So we want to go back in, select our 3D camera here, and bring up the camera properties. So layer, camera settings, or just Control-Shift-Y, which is what I typically use. And then if we take a look at the focal length here, it's actually 30.8574. So we'll copy that, go back to Blender, and paste that focal length into the camera focal length here. Now, if we scrub the timeline, we can see that that track is locked on there. This is the area that was giving us problems before, but that looks pretty solid. Let's just move around here a little bit and see. Yeah, so that's pretty solid. I like that track. One final thing is that this male human model is actually supposed to be 6 feet tall, and he's looking a little small compared to the rest of the scene. So I'm going to show you a trick to fix the world scale. This is going to get you roughly in the area. If you want to fix it manually by eye, here's a good trick. We'll come into our 3D viewport and we'll create an empty. Make sure the empty is at the center of the world origin. What we want to do is take the empty that the plane is parented to, so this one, and we also want to take the empty that the camera is parented to, so this one. So just shift click and then one more time shift click on that empty that we just created here, and then hit Control P. And we can parent that to this empty. So now the plane and the camera are parented to this empty that we just created. And what we can do here is actually scale it up and down. And as you can see, they all scale. And this is not going to mess up our track. If we look at it inside of the camera, if I hit S and scale this up and down, you can see that our world and the guy is scaling. You keep an eye on the grid in the background. You can see that that's moving. So let's say, I don't know, maybe around there is the proper scale. Roughly. Now, the good thing about this is that because both of these, the camera and the plane, are parented to this empty, whatever transforms we make are not going to mess up the track. So we can actually rotate this like this. And even though it's rotated, it's still locked on. It's just not aligned to the world origin. So don't do that. But so that's just to prove my point that we're not really going to mess up the track. So the reason why it doesn't mess up our track is because we're doing the same transform to the camera as well as the plane. It's always going to be locked on. The only thing we're changing is the world around the plane and the camera. So that's a good way to adjust the scene to scale if the scale is not right. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt this video. I just want to remind you to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos, including future filmmaking and visual effects tutorials. All right, let's jump back in. So now I want to show you what happens if we don't click on Set Ground Plane and Origin. So we'll start over from the beginning here, and I'll retrack our footage. Okay, so we have our tracking markers here, and we'll just select a point on the ground. That's looking good. So I'm going to right click. Again, we're not going to select Set Ground Plane and Origin. We're just going to create the solid and the camera. So let's do that. And if we scrub through here, we can see that that's locked on there. It's looking good. So again, we'll copy over our camera data. So position and orientation, copy, or just edit, copy. Come over to Blender. Let's get rid of the camera and the light, and we'll open up the menu here and set this to 1000. Scroll up and create camera. Click on that. You can see the camera imported. If we just kind of move the playhead, it jumps into place there. I don't know why it does that, but again, we have to change the offset here. So just move all the keyframes over one frame. There we go. Immediately, you can see that the camera is just in the wrong spot. It's below the world grid and it's facing straight on when it should be looking down at a ground plane. So as I move this around, you can see already how bad the alignment is. So we'll switch back to After Effects and we'll grab our solid and we'll grab the transform data. So again, anchor point through orientation, copy that, and then click on create plane. Let me move this view so you can see where the plane comes in. So create plane, and we're gonna actually scale up the plane so you can see it. Immediately you can see that the plane is just all messed up. It's not flat with the world grid, it's in the wrong spot. The plane is tilted instead of the camera. So let's set up our footage inside the camera and see what this looks like. So I'm just going to change the settings here. So 1080 by 1920, switch the frame rate to 24, go into our camera settings, import the background movie clip. We'll go into the camera and we'll just change the opacity, bring that up to 1. I won't make it a shadow catcher yet. So as you can see here, this is still kind of messed up. It's kind of floating, as you can see here. If I just zoom in, you can see the plane looks like it's floating right there. And again, that's because we didn't switch our focal length. So let's change our focal length. We'll go back to After Effects and bring up the camera settings, copy the focal length here. So it's 30.8574, switch over, paste it into the focal length of the camera here. And now, if we look at our footage, this actually looks locked onto the ground. So the track is actually still good. The only problem is that it's not flush to the surface of the world grid. So always click on set ground plane and origin. But if you can't, I'll show you how to fix this. So what we want to do is, just like last time, we want to create an empty at the center of the world grid. And we want to select the empty that the camera is parented to and the empty that the solid is parented to. And then finally, we'll select the empty that we just created and hit Control P. So same process as last time. But now we're going to have to do a little tweaking to fix this scene. So I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard to go into the front view. And you can see here that this is the x-axis. So we want to align this plane with the x-axis and then also with the y-axis. And we'll get to that in a second. So if you remember from earlier, because the camera and the plane are parented to this empty here, we were able to make adjustments and not mess up the track, right? We were able to rotate it and everything, and it just rotated the world around the track, but the track wasn't affected at all. What we could do is press 1 on the keyboard and actually make some adjustments here so that this plane is flush with the X and Y axis. So what we're going to do is select this empty that we created, and then we can start rotating this. So we'll hit RX. And again, we pressed 1 on the keyboard, so the x-axis is going left to right here. That's very important. So now we want to rotate on that axis. So we'll hit RX, and we'll just kind of spin this until that plane disappears. And then we'll hit GZ and move it up until it aligns with the x-axis. And one thing to note is that we can't see the plane right now, but we can see the empty that it's parented to. And if I jump out here, you can see that that empty is right in the center of the plane. We'll press 1 to jump back into this front view, and we'll just align. We have to zoom all the way in for this, so we're just going to move this up. So GZ, and align that empty with the x-axis. And you can see here that we can see the plane, so we want to rotate it a bit more. So RX, and if you hold shift, you can, instead of making these big rotational movements, we can hold shift and it'll do smaller increments here. So let's just rotate this until it kind of disappears. I'm holding shift to get a more fine-tuned rotation. And roughly there, so we'll hit GZ, bring this up. If you notice here, this is the empty, so use that as a guide. This is the empty that the plane is attached to. So we'll go back and select that world master empty that we created. And I'll just change the name here to master empty so you know what I'm talking about. We'll select that and we'll zoom in all the way, and let's just fix this. So RX, and we'll just rotate this until it disappears. So roughly there. So you can see that line. And we'll just hit G, Z, and bring this up. And make sure it's aligned with the x-axis. So now that that's aligned, we can press 3 and go over to the y-axis. We'll zoom out here. And let's see where we're at. So this is actually pretty good, but we can see that this is the plane here and it's not flat. So we'll select our master empty over here, zoom in. We will press RY this time. Now remember, by pressing 3 on the keyboard, we're actually in the right orthographic view. And this is the horizontal line here is the Y axis, and you can tell by the color. So we'll select our master empty and hit RY. And now you can see that we can just rotate this until it flattens itself out. And we'll have to zoom in to get even more accurate. So roughly here, I hit RY again. And just rotate this until this kind of disappears right there. And then we can hit GZ and just bring it up. Now we can't see it, so we'll have to rely on the empty that the plane is parented to. So right there, we'll zoom in all the way so we can get this accurate and make sure our master empty is selected, hit GZ and just bring it up and align it to the Y. Just keep on zooming in so we can get as accurate as possible. And right there. Okay, now we'll press 1 on the keyboard and we'll zoom out to find everything here. So here it's looking like that plane is also aligned to the x-axis because we're zooming in and we don't see it. So that's a good thing. All right, perfect. So now if I go back out into our perspective view, you can see that it's actually flat and aligned to the surface. Now the only thing is that it's not at the center. So what I can do is just hit G and then Shift Z to prevent it from moving on the Z axis. And we can just move this into place here. And then I can hit 1 on the keyboard to make sure that this empty, which is, again, that's the one that the plane is parented to. So 1, make sure that that's aligned with the center here. Make sure your master empty is selected, GX to move it on the X axis. And we'll just kind of align that to the center, zoom in as much as you can to get this accurate. GX, and then just shift. And I'm holding shift to get a more fine movement. So right there, I think is perfectly aligned. And then I'm going to hit 3 to make sure that the Y axis is aligned here. And it's close. It's close. So make sure the master empty is selected, press GY, and we'll just move this now into place. You can see that that's the empty that the plane is parented to. So we'll just align that, and then we'll zoom in all the way. GY, and just move this around until we get it right in the center there. Perfect. And now we can see that our camera and our plane are aligned to the world origin. The camera is looking good. It's pointed down at the plane instead of the plane being rotated. And if we jump into our camera, we can see that that track is locked on there. And now we have the ground plane aligned with the world grid. So one final step is that the scene scale is a little bit off. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky because we can't just take our master empty here and scale this. Technically we could, but it's going to change the position of everything, right? So as I'm scaling, you can see a lot of things are happening that we don't want. So I'm just going to undo that. And what I'm going to do here instead is create another empty. And we'll just make this a cube. Just shrink that down, and we'll name this master scale empty. So then we can click on the master empty here. And I probably should have named this master position rotation empty. Again, the master scale empty, you want to make sure that it's created where the center of it is in the middle of the world origin. So we'll select the position and rotation empty, and then shift click the master scale empty, and then hit Control P. and parent that. And now we can select the master scale empty, go into our camera view, and we can scale this. And this is going to scale it around the world origin instead of scaling it around this point here, which is sort of just some arbitrary floating point here. So this is going to make our lives a lot easier. So we can just scale this, and I'm going to say roughly, I don't know, let's say roughly there is good. When we scrub the timeline, you can see that that track is still locked on there. So one final thing we can do is we can just select all these empties and everything that's parented to it. So we can kind of, let's say the master scale empty, we can just go into item here and under transform, lock everything. We can go and select the master position rotation empty, lock everything there so we can't move it. We can select our camera transform empty, lock everything there. And we can also select our camera, lock that. We can do the same thing for the plane empty, lock that, and the plane as well. So just lock everything so that we can't accidentally move it. We're pretty happy with this track. So now we can start adding all these different things to the scene. And now we can start adding all these different things to the scene. And we should be able to have that kind of locked onto the ground, because our tracking data is all set. If you want to use this plane as a shadow catcher, you're going to have to scale it up. So we can just go back into the plane, unlock it, and we can scale everything up, and then go in here, go to visibility, and click shadow catcher. So now all of this is going to be shadow catcher. We'll add an HDRI. So this plane is going to be a shadow catcher. We'll make it transparent, and you can see that we have our shadows, and this track is looking good. Nothing's slipping, it's looking good. So that's another way we can flatten the ground plane to the world grid. It's pretty time consuming to do that, so I would just suggest going into After Effects and always selecting set ground plane in origin. But if you forget, or for some reason you can't do that, then this method I just showed you is a good way to align the ground plane to the world grid. And like I said earlier, you can use whatever method you want. You can use the Blender tracker. You can use a different 3D camera tracker. It's all up to you, whatever you feel comfortable with. In the end, it doesn't matter as long as you get a solid track. So use whatever you feel comfortable with. But if you were curious about using After Effects and the AE2Blend script to get your camera and ground plane data into Blender from After Effects, then this is a good method to do that. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Once again, my name is Paul Del Vecchio, and I'll see you next time.